Welcome, my friends. In this video, I'll be discussing section 2.2, bar graphs and pie graphs, two ways that we can graphically display a categorical variable. Let's start with a bar graph. A bar graph is going to display the levels, which is just a special way of saying the possible values of a categorical variable on the horizontal axis, and either frequency or percentage on the vertical axis. Note that the axes could be switched around, but this is the traditional way that it will be shown. In this case, we have the example from the previous video, which is the voting district or precinct of a number of individuals from a sample. The first graph shows the count on the vertical axis, and the second graph shows the percentage. So we can see that the most common precinct was number 1, with 20 respondents choosing that option, and that represented 40% of the total individuals. The least common was the question mark, which was the I don't know option, which was 2% of the individuals from the sample. As is mentioned in the description, the levels of the categorical variable are on the horizontal axis, which in this case are the different possible precincts. The vertical axis is, as we said, either frequency or sometimes labeled count, and percentage on the second graph. Both graphs look exactly the same. The picture is no different. The only difference is the labels. So no matter if you use count or percentage, the bars are really going to look the same, but they are just displaying slightly different information. Note that traditionally on a bar graph, there will be a small amount of space between each of the bars to represent the separateness of each of the categories. Later, when we talk about a histogram, which is basically a bar graph for a quantitative variable, there will not be any space between the bars, but that's a topic for a different video. As I mentioned a moment ago, no matter if we use count or percentage for our vertical axis, we're really going to get the same shape for our bars. We're just going to be displaying slightly different information. Now, there are a couple of things I want to mention about the way that this textbook is defining a bar graph. So first of all, it's defining it as always being used for a categorical variable. That's not always the case. And secondly, it's always defining it as our vertical axis representing count or percentage. And that also is not always the case. But just for simplicity, most of the bar graphs we're going to end up using, and you could say most of the bar graphs that are used are going to be following this convention. But I'm going to show you an example here on the next slide that does not follow that convention. And to do that, I'm going to also introduce the idea of a clustered bar graph. So in a clustered bar graph, we're going to display at least 2 bars for each label on the horizontal axis. And we're going to dedicate more time to clustered bar graphs in a separate section. But here's an example I just wanted to show you. So here we have the life expectancy of both men and women, and we have 2 different kind of ways to show this. So both the graph on the left and the right are displaying the exact same information, but the display is a little bit different. So I want you to kind of focus on the difference between these and see if you can tell why these 2 graphs look a little bit different. So here we have 2 graphs which are clustered by gender, because every kind of a label on the horizontal axis here has a bar for each of the different genders or sexes here. We have men and women for each of the different categories. So we would say that these graphs are clustered by gender. Now the graph on the right has this little changing scale symbol that indicates that we're kind of jumping the scale. We go from 0 and then we jump all the way up to 65 to 70, 75, etc. So you notice here we don't have frequency for our vertical axis like was defined on the previous slide. So there can be exceptions to that, like we have actually a quantitative variable here. Now the thing I want to mention, and the reason why I'm showing you this example, is typically with a bar graph we would really like to have the bars be proportional to how large the axis is, our vertical axis is, right? So what that would mean is if we have a bar that's twice as large as another bar, then ideally that would mean that we have twice as large of the value on our vertical axis. And you'll notice that the graph on the right does not adhere to that, right? It appears that the women bar, let's just look at the 1980, the women bar for the life expectancy is almost twice as large as the bar for men. But the numbers don't play that out, right? The 77.4 is not twice as large as the 70. So for that reason, this graph on the right could be considered to be a little bit misleading. So we would ideally like to have a graph like the one on the left that does not have this changing scale. Because whenever you have this changing scale symbol, it's going to distort the graph in some way such that now the bars are not truly proportional to the value on your vertical axis. So that's something to look out for in terms of misleading graphs. Sometimes this could be a way that someone could use a graph to mislead you, to kind of exaggerate the difference between categories. So make sure you're always looking out for that. All right, so here is another similar example. We have group on our horizontal axis, and then we have sales on our vertical axis. And once again, we have the same information on these two graphs, but they're just displayed a little bit differently in terms of their vertical axis. So the one on the left starts at 8,300 and the one at the right starts at 0. So the one on the left is going to be distorting the picture in some way, because now that we're not starting at 0, the bars are not really proportional to the sales. So if you look at the A sales amount, it's like 8,450, and the D sales amount is about 8,750. But the D bar is more than twice as large as the A bar. So you'd expect the sales to be more than twice as high, but that is not the case based on this picture. So I would not agree with using this graph on the left, even though maybe it's visually more appealing. The one that's more true to the numbers would be the one on the right-hand side. So my comment here is the chart on the left really should have that changing scale symbol, and then even with the changing scale, it could be considered to be misleading. So whenever I am looking at a bar graph, I'm always going to be focusing on the vertical axis. If the vertical axis does not start at 0 or has that changing scale symbol, then I'm probably not going to be paying that much attention to this bar graph. Here's an example right after the COVID vaccines were going out from, I think this was based on Joe Biden's Facebook page. They put this out, and this was supposed to be representing the number of eligible unvaccinated American adults. So before there was some sort of vaccine requirement, I think for government employees, apparently there were 95 million individuals who were eligible for the vaccine. And then today, sometime later, it was only 67 million. So clearly the purpose of this graph was to show that the vaccine requirement is working and that a lot less people are eligible to be vaccinated now because more and more people are getting vaccinated for COVID-19. But if you look at the scale, we can see that we start at 50 million. So now I know since we start at 50 million, really the bars are not doing very much justice to the numbers. The bar on the left is more than twice as large as the bar on the right, but the numbers don't flesh that out. 95 million is not more than twice as much as 67 million, so this could be considered to be somewhat of a misleading graph. If this was graphed from 0, then the graph would look something more like this. And there's no reason not to start at 0 other than to distort the picture. So this would really be a lot better representation of the picture. Still shows that the number has gone down, but it's just not quite as dramatic as it seems to be based on the graph on the left. Here's another example, and this was from Fox News back when Tucker Carlson was on that show, and is showing the percentage of Americans that identify as Christian. So apparently in 2009, based on this Pew Research Center maybe poll, 77% of individuals were Christian in America, and then based on a 2019 poll, it was down to 65%. And of course, the goal of this image here is to show that, oh, there's so many less Christians here today in America than there were, even just 10 years ago. And that's certainly what the bar graph kind of is showing. If you just look at the lengths of the bars, you would be led to think, wow, it's quite a big drop off. But then once you look at the vertical axis here, you see the vertical axis starts not at 0, but at 58. Why would you start the vertical axis not at 0 in this case? We really should be using something more like this. So if we started at 0, this is what those two bars would look like. So once again, we have this situation where the bar on the left is more than twice as large as the bar on the right, but the number is not even close to twice as large. So once again, this is a distortion. This is a misleading use of bar charts, and we really should be using something more like the one on the right. All right, so let's next talk about the pie chart, sometimes called the pie graph or the circle graph, which is going to display a categorical variable with either percentage or counts. When there are too many categories, maybe you should not be using a pie chart because it can get messy and difficult to read. So here is just a pie chart based on some made-up information that I created, and this one's kind of on the edge of having too many categories. I think it's still readable, but it's kind of getting on the edge. It's a little bit messy for a pie chart. So we have the percentages here of the preferred music genre for a number of different individuals. Now, the percentages on a pie chart really have to add up to 100%. When people see pie charts, they kind of expect that they're all out of one grand total. So that's the way that you should be representing a pie chart. Sometimes you could have a survey where questions could be answered more than one time. You could maybe check multiple boxes, and then that would lead to a case where the totals do not add up to 100%. And if that was the case, then you really should not be using a pie chart to represent that data. If we know the sample size, we can determine the number of individuals in each group once we have the percentages. So an example of that is, let's just say that the sample size for this was 427. If that was the case, then we could figure out the number of individuals in each of those categories from the sample by taking basically the decimal equivalent of each of these percentages and multiplying by 427. So if I took 0.19, which is the decimal equivalent of 19%, and multiplied it by the 427 individuals, I would find that 81 individuals from the sample preferred rap music. All right, so here is a pie chart for you to kind of just look at. So I'll just give you a second to look at this pie chart and see if you can find any issues. Well, there are a number of issues here. So the first thing that you probably notice is that these three percentages did not add up to 100%, right? The question says Americans who have tried marijuana, we have today, we have last year, and we have 1997. And these three numbers do not add up to 100%. Why do they not add up to 100%? Well, they're not really all out of one grand total, right? They're really just three separate surveys, which each have their own percentages. And there's no reason to think that those three percentages would add up to 100%. So therefore, there's not really any reason to display this data on a pie chart. But that doesn't stop them from doing it. So here is, I'm not sure who this person is, but they had a tweet about this. This is back in 2019. They said, first of all, it's a pie chart. Second of all, the total is greater than 100%. And 3, the relevant categories are today, last year, and ... the year 1997. So kind of, I guess, criticizing like why the big gap in the years there. And I'm not sure if anyone caught this, but the margin of error, MOE, is listed as the source. Okay, the source is supposed to be where you got your data from, not your margin of error. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense as a source there, right? So I'm not really, with any of these examples, I'm not really trying to, poke fun at or cast shame on any, given news organization or anything. Like, you can probably find examples of these from pretty much anyone, right? I'm just trying to show you some examples that I have came across, right? Not trying to pick on anyone in particular. Here's another example. This was once again, right, when COVID-19 was just a really big deal back in 2020. And we had the biggest worries, either getting it, family getting it, and the economy. So think about the problem here. So imagine you are the news anchor and they put this in front of you and you have to report on this. What do? You just make something up and you try to make it work? Or do you call it out on air and say, wait just a minute, why are we displaying this on a pie chart? I'm not really sure what I would do in the moment, but of course here, once again, the percentages do not add up to 100, right? So the reason in this case is probably because individuals could select multiple of these options, right? So since you can have multiple options here, then the totals are not going to be out of 100. They're going to be out of something greater than 100, right? So a better way to display that might be in some sort of bar chart. Okay, so that's just a few different ways that you could see bar charts and pie charts misused. So make sure you're looking out for those types of things whenever you see any of these charts. Please send me any interesting examples that you come across, and maybe I'll use them in a future lecture or a future presentation. I'm always willing to, take a look at them, especially if they are for, recent examples and from like reputable news agencies. So please send them my way. But other than that, that's all I had to talk about in this video. So I will see you in the next one.